Welcome to the Startup Grind.
Susan Wu. Alright, so tonight I'm going to give you this. Unfortunately, this microphone
I think.
is no good. That's just for the camera.
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay.
Does this do anything?
Yeah, I
Hello?
yeah.
Alright. This is the good one, you get the good one.
Okay.
Alright, so hopefully I'm asking the questions that you guys are thinking. Sorry? Oh, and my team. I want to thank my team. It doesn't go louder. So hopefully I'm asking the questions that you guys are thinking as we go through this story tonight, and at the end you guys get a chance to ask a question ask a question, and let's get started. So thank you for coming.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me.
I know you've been busy with your Stripe stuff, so we're not going to talk about that at all tonight.
Okay.
Okay. I want to hear your story. That's what I think everyone's here to hear. They want to hear the early days of Twitter. They want to hear what happened at Square. They want to hear what happens when, a crazy IPO in New York, that kind of stuff. But before we get started on that, can I go back and hear what your education was, and did you grow up in the Valley? How?
Oh yeah, sure. I grew up in Southern California, and like all American kids who are going to university, I wanted to go as far away from home as I possibly could. So I went to Boston for university, and I studied philosophy. And that's kind of how I got into tech, actually. I got into tech kind of accidentally. Someone in my high school introduced me to BBSs, and I thought it was super cool that I could start talking to people all around the world. Mind you, this was the time of dial-up BBSs, so it was very, very, very slow talking to other people around the world, usually involving overnight waits for messages in return. And when I went to university, I was able to get a job at the computer lab at school, and that kind of intersected with my interest in philosophy and cognitive science. I've always been really interested in just how do people think, and what are the kinds of ideas that we hold in our brains that are first principles versus inherited from our culture. And I kind of taught myself how to program in C so that I could start building MUDs. MUDs are essentially text-based multiplayer online games. Think World of Warcraft or Minecraft, but like entirely text-based. So it was really exciting. And I basically built these MUDs so that I could begin to experiment with kind of like humanity and human relationships with one another. So like some of the earliest concepts that I started experimenting with were things like, if you take a group of people in an online community and you start to give them things like ownership rights to their virtual land, or if you start to give them things like voting rights to determine their governance structure, how does that impact the growth of the community, the health of the community, and how does that impact how people think about their citizenship in these worlds? And that's basically those principles have basically driven my career to date. Like, those are still the same issues that I'm interested in.
Well, I know you talk about this first principles.
Yeah.
Can you hear me in the back with that? No, I'll just yell. You talk about these first principles quite a bit.
Yeah.
Can you explain what that is?
It's just, so in philosophy we would call it like a priori type stuff. Like basically, what are the things that are fundamentally true about the world? And what are, like those kinds of things would be first principles. And then kind of layered on top of that are all the things that we inherit from our parents, all the things that we inherit from our culture, like belief systems. For example, like, I believe that it's good to, pay my bills on time. That kind of thing is not a first principle. That's the kind of thing that I've inherited from socialization and from other people. But, very basic concepts like I believe that it's good to take care of the people around me is like one of the very first principles. So first principles are essentially building blocks of belief systems that you could string together to create more and more interesting belief systems. And the reason why I care about that is because if you're trying to create something super novel or innovative, you want to be really clear in your head about what you're inheriting from other people's belief systems and what you're choosing to believe yourself. I don't want this to devolve into a whole conversation about religion and politics, but
no, I'll keep going track. Right.
Yeah, but in general, I feel like it's good for us to know, even when we can't change what we inherit, to know what we are inheriting so that we can be really clear, like, this is who I choose to be, these are the kinds of things I choose to build. These are, like, one of the things I talk about a lot in software design is that, all algorithms are essentially moral constructs. So if you just think about Google, for example, like on the surface, Google seems like a system that is about organizing the world's information. But then if you start to ask more questions, you start to realize, well, organize the world's information according to what principles, like according to what priorities, according to what optimization patterns, and all of those things are essentially moral constructs that they're basically passing down to us as users of the service. And so when I think about creating virtual communities, or when I think about creating products, I'm always thinking, like, what's fundamental and what are things like that are basically just being socialized. Like, so Facebook, for example, does this as well. The kinds of information that they show in your feed are heavily editorialized and heavily prioritized according to their own algorithms, which have, adhere to the Facebook belief, Mark Zuckerberg's belief system as to like what is proper and interesting about how people should organize themselves, which may or may not agree with how you think about it, right? And so just being clear about these things seems important to me.
So this MUDs,
yeah.
MUDs. So going back to this you put some of these principles in this game by the sound of things.
Yeah.
Was this the first company that went to IPO that
No.
you knew about? No?
No MUD company has ever IPO'd that I know. No, these were all spectacularly commercial
I was waiting
failures.
to hear how it turned. What happened? Did it grow? What happened?
No, it was just like a fun side project.
Okay.
But at the time, this is one of those unknown stories that I've never really told that you might be interested
Yeah, go on.
in.
Let's hear it.
So I was actually dating someone at the time who who was quite well known in the internet space. I was dating Will Wheaton, and who is like he was like an actor on Star Trek Next Generation. And so to all the engineer nerds out there, like, he's pretty well known. So we built these MUDs together, and we were building like BBSs together, and there's no commercial success to any of this.
All right, so it's all right. But so that was one of your early projects when you got out of school. What happened? You left school. What did you do? Where's this? Like, I know you had
I ended up dropping out of school.
Okay.
Mostly because, school became boring after a while. I think that, like...
Too many MUDs to build?
Yeah, just too many interesting things happening online too quickly. And I did end up going back to finish my degree, and then I ended up going back for another degree in finance and economics, but that's another story.
Right. So what's this company that IPO'd at?
Oh yeah, sure. So after I left university, I got a series of jobs working first as a systems administrator for some various ISPs, and then as a product manager. And one of my bosses at one of these companies said, "Hey, I'm going to go off and start a new company. Do you want to help me start this thing?" And so the company was called Opus 360. We had a product that was relatively well known at the time called freeagent.com. And it was really similar to today's Freelancer, and also kind of similar in some ways to 99 Designs. But basically, it was a marketplace and platform for free agents to find work and to sell their services. And the company had a successful IPO in March of 2000, right before the bubble. So for a few spectacular months, I felt very wealthy. And then I was sad and not feeling very wealthy anymore. Yeah.
But is that what kind of got you hooked in the startup world? I know that you've had 6 companies that you've invested in have sold for over $1 billion. Is that correct?
I don't think they've sold yet, but yeah, but have raised financing at billion-dollar valuations, or some of them have exited, but not too many yet.
What I'm saying is, you're probably doing pretty well for yourself. What keeps you, motivated in this kind of hectic startup land?
Well, that's like sort of the question as to like why we all live in general, right? I think we do it because we are driven by creative energy to change the world around us and to do something that we believe in. And I can't imagine ever retiring. And also, fundamentally, I believe that the amount of money you need to retire is not very much money at all. And there's no concept of retirement. Basically, like, you should be constantly working towards fulfilling your creative energy.
No, that was nice.
Yeah.
Nice way of putting it. So first IPO was with another guy. What was next for Susan Webb?
Well, so then after the market crash, and then I felt like I had lost all of this fake money, I went and did yoga on the beach for a couple years. and then I chilled out, and then I kept building things. I taught myself how to design jewelry, and then I built an online jewelry store, and I started contributing to various open source projects, and got back heavily involved in the open source community. I joined the Apache Software Foundation and helped become, I was the CMO of the Apache Software Foundation for a while, and helped that community grow and flourish into many different projects. I think that Apache is pretty interesting. It started off as one project, the web server, the HTTP server. At one point, the web server had 80% global market share, which was pretty exciting. But what's more exciting is that the Apache Software Foundation has grown to about, something like 200 projects today, including things like Hadoop and things that form the very basic infrastructure for almost every internet service that you're using out there. And so being part of a global movement like that to create a really long-lasting community that can sustain itself for generations of internet success is pretty interesting and awesome.
Well, you touched on a point about open source. I know that's something you're passionate about. You want to talk about that for a little bit, and the problem with what you see with today not being open source.
Well, I think, so one of the reasons, we weren't going to talk about Stripe too much, but this is very personal. So one of the reasons I was really excited about joining Stripe was because there are very few massive internet problems out there still left to solve. And if you think about how easy it's become in the last 20 years to create a website anywhere in the world and start communicating immediately with anyone else in the world, and you can basically do that kind of thing instantaneously these days with either Facebook or WordPress or Twitter. And if you compare the ease of that use to how difficult it is to, basically start a new online business that can transact globally, with anyone in the world, like someone in Australia being able to sell to customers in Dubai immediately, or basically hire a freelancer in Saudi Arabia, or sell merchandise in Colombia instantaneously. That's still a very, very hard problem to solve. So it's really strange to me that there's no such thing like as a commerce stack for the internet. And so the reason why I was really interested in joining Stripe is that this is a company that has global ambitions and really wants to solve big problems and wants to do it in a relatively open and transparent way in which the entire community can contribute to the core platform that we're building. So one of the things I had mentioned to you in the email is that, in general, I feel like, to some extent, the internet has reversed on itself. It has gone from being extremely open to being these several large monolithic walled gardens where data is relatively trapped within them. And
do you think that's a result of big corporate companies?
I think it's a result of economies of scale and speed of movement. I think in the long run, organizations like Apache will probably outlast many of these large monolithic consumer organizations, but they do move slower. And so I'm following along with what Zuckerberg is doing with internet.org with great interest. Like, I am super supportive of companies moving back towards open platforms and data transparency, and also one of the reasons why I'm excited about Bitcoin is, even despite the recent conflagration with Mt. Gox, it's still a pretty interesting democratic platform that anyone can build on top of. So these kinds of things, I think, are interesting signs of hopefully a new future.
Yep. So. No, I like the thought of Bitcoin. I have an import business, so I get screwed on currency all the time.
Yeah, well, you could use Stripe for multi-currency needs, but again, we're not here to talk about that.
Fantastic. So, you're a hacker. You're getting involved in these businesses. How did you become a VC? Can we just touch on that for a second?
I think almost everyone I know in Silicon Valley is a VC to some extent, because basically what happens is you hang out in Silicon Valley, you walk down the street, and you just run into 20 startup founders, right? And those people become your friends, and some of them become really successful. And when you go to start your next business, you just ask your friends, like you do here, what do you think of my idea? Do you want to help me on it? And that's kind of how most people get started. I was actually an institutional VC for a while. I was with Charles River Ventures, which is, I guess, they raised somewhere between $450 million or $600 million per each fund. And so that was a different experience. You know, institutional VC is super different from angel investing. I think that there's a lot more joy in angel investing. I think when you're an institutional venture capitalist, you're really like a finance manager to some extent. You know, really your customer to some extent is the LP, even though there's a lot of dialogue about how your customer is an entrepreneur. At the end of the day, it's the LPs who are judging your, you know, your performance as a fund to some extent.
So was it at this stage when Twitter walks through the door and pitches you guys, kind of thing?
Yeah. So the Twitter story. I mean, I'm sure a lot of people are really familiar with it. So one of the partners at Charles River Ventures, George Zachary, was the original investor of Odeo, which was a startup that Evan Williams had founded after he had sold Blogger to Google. And Odeo was a podcasting startup, and it wasn't really working out. I think CRV had put something like $5 million into the Series A round, and this was in the days of relatively large Series A's. And at some point, Evan and the team were like, you know, hey, this isn't working out. Let's, you know, especially because Apple just announced that they were going to go into podcasting, which basically meant the death of the company. So a small number of engineers at the company said, okay, let's hack on some new ideas, which was relatively unique at the time. I mean, that's become pretty common these days in startup culture to, you know, pivot and to work on multiple ideas in parallel. At the time, it was relatively unique. And he went to the board and he said, you know, Odeo is not working out. I want to buy back, I want to buy you guys out so that you don't have to lose money on my failed idea. And so that's basically what happened. And then at some point, you know, after a few weeks, you know, there was a new idea, and it was kind of the seeds of Twitter. And, you know, he came in and pitched. So actually, this is an interesting story. I remember this quite vividly because Jack Dorsey was such a strange character. So Jack and Ev, and then someone I can't remember, although it must have been Noah. I can't quite remember who was the third person. Came in and pitched us at CRV at the time on Twitter. We must have been one of the very first pitches because they hadn't raised any money yet. And I just remember Jack sitting in the corner, and he was very, very quiet the whole time. And finally, at the end of, you know, whoever it was, I think it must have been Evan Noah, had been pitching Twitter. And at the time, like, Jack had just been sitting in the corner very quietly. And we kind of looked at him and we were like, you know, what do you think of this idea? And he started talking about all the things that he's really famous for talking about now, which are like cities and transit patterns in the city and how taxis move around. And as a VC, I could see like the other partners in the room didn't quite know what to make of Jack and his like very, very, very quiet intensity and his extreme obsessive fixation on, you know, kind of arcane issues revolving around taxi transport in the city. And so, you know, in a VC fund, most partners, I mean, famously, most VC partners ask their teenagers to help them understand social media technology because, you know, they're not the most social media connected people. And so at the time, I think that a lot of the CRV team was like, huh, that's kind of weird. I don't know, what do you guys think of this idea? And no one could really make sense of it.
Yeah, well, that's I think that's what I heard from George Zachary telling the story, that he was kind of like, is this any good, or is it, you know, is it just me? And they were kind of on the fence, and lucky, I guess, they went with the investment, right? Well, you did too.
Well, I kind of had the sense that it was going to be awesome immediately, and it became very, very clear that it was going to be awesome immediately when shortly thereafter we went to South by Southwest. And I mean, the story of how Twitter launched at South by Southwest was famous, but I just remember laying in my hotel room at 3 a.m. and my phone was basically buzzing nonstop all night with messages from people all over the conference updating each other about what was going on. And so even though I was tired and retiring in my hotel room, there was this constant buzz of activity all around me, and it became very clear very early on.
So what, they launched at South by Southwest?
Yeah, essentially, yeah. So basically, I think it was kind of an accident that they launched there and that it became such a huge success, but it was just a huge concentration of very early adopters who were kind of, a number of whom were already on the service, and they thought it would be a great place to just share information about what was going on around you with a very highly highly dense audience of early adopters who would be very interested. And a number of companies have gone on to adopt the South by Southwest launch strategy, and so much so that it's no longer that interesting to launch at South by Southwest because it's so flooded with people trying to target that audience. But Foursquare also launched there and had similar success.
So just touching on Twitter again,
Sure.
how much, so you were advising these guys to what degree? And how do you get, I know South by Southwest might have been a successful platform for them, but how do you get to millions of people where you're not just broadcasting a tweet to nobody?
I think the one thing that I've learned from working with Ev and Jack, and also Katarina Fake, and also Patrick and John from Stripe, I think the number one trait that they all share is not just their curiosity, but also their extreme patience. So Evan Williams is extraordinarily patient. I just was a founding partner at Obvious Corporation, which is the incubator that he started after he left Twitter. And the Obvious Corporation spawned Medium. And just working with him on a daily basis was pretty interesting. I mean, he's very patient. They don't think about products in terms of short-term objectives. They think about products in terms of, what do I want to do to change this industry? What kind of product do I want to see in this industry in 10 years? How do I get there? That's how they think about things. So one big aspect of that is community building and community cultivation. I think community is one of the most underrated virtues that a startup has in its toolbox for differentiation. But community takes a lot of patience and careful attention. And so I think the Twitter community, as was the Medium community, as was the early Square community, was very, very carefully cultivated in terms of, picking a handful of key early adopters, making them feel very special and loved, and helping them be a core part of the conversation that was happening at the company around product and features, and really building a base around people who are passionate and turning those people into essentially evangelists. When Square launched, for a long time, the earliest, the first 10 merchants were essentially all the merchants within a 2-block radius of Jack's apartment, right? And that was because, for a couple of reasons. One, the relationships were there, but also, I think Jack had very strong intention that he wanted to see how Square felt to be used in his daily habits as he was moving around his daily activities, right? And so being able to have that exposure to that kind of pattern was pretty important.
So just to give everyone that doesn't know what Square is, it's basically a thing you put in on top of your iPhone, right, to take payments.
Yeah, it's essentially a point-of-sale system that works with any kind of mobile device to allow people to accept payments.
And there's been a few big copycats since Square.
It's hard to say in the internet industry what's a copycat and what's not a copycat, right? Everyone's, calculus was invented simultaneously by a couple of different parties in multiple countries around the world, even though one person is credited more or less with its invention. I think the same thing is true of great internet technology.
Sure.
Yeah.
So we touched on Twitter a little bit. Tell me about the Square team and your involvement with that.
So when Jack left Twitter, we started talking about what he was working on, and...
Sorry, so was Jack this kind of guy that was like, my work's done here, that's going to be a big success? On to the next one?
Absolutely not. I mean, Twitter is really his life's work in many ways. So the reason why the story about Jack talking about taxis and transit systems around New York City is interesting is because he's been thinking about the problem of Twitter for years, for his whole career. And even after he left, when he left Twitter, I think it was very bittersweet. I don't think it was something that he felt good about. And even after he left Twitter, I think he was very, his mind still remained every day on the product and what he could do to improve it, but he was no longer, a daily part of the company. And I think when he started Square, he poured a lot of his kind of emotional and creative energy into that project, almost in a way to heal himself from having left Twitter. Obviously, later he was vindicated by being invited back to be executive chairman of Twitter at a later point, but yeah.
Damage was done.
No, I think today he's probably feeling pretty good.
All right, yeah. So I know that, I don't know if this is a story I'm meant to, but George Zachary gave our founder, because they catch up, whatever, cufflinks that he got as a gift from the Twitter guys that were from the floorboards.
Of the original office, yeah.
Yeah. So can you talk about like how amazing is it to be like the day of the IPO? What's going through your head if Twitter's about to IPO? You've got shares in this business.
I think it's totally different when you're an investor versus being an actual founder. So when my company went public, that I was an actual co-founder of, I mean, it was absolutely exhilarating, right? I mean, it is, and also terrifying, because now all of a sudden you're opening yourself up to public scrutiny. After having gone through the IPO process, I don't think it's like the most exciting process anymore. I think in fact, it can constrain companies' trajectories for growth going public, because now all of a sudden you're beholden to the public markets and to quarterly earnings reports and to all kinds of decorum about how you're able to conduct business. So I'm sorry I'm taking away from the emotional impact of the story.
Yeah.
But I mean, yeah, I mean, it was super exciting. In your mind, you're obviously thinking, wow, like, I've made it. This is awesome. But I think after having gone through the IPO and now after having gone through multiple IPOs as an investor, you realize that the IPO is just yet another milestone in the company's history, and to be honest, no more or less important than any other major milestones. Probably becoming profitable, probably realizing that you have a sustainable business, probably realizing that you're changing your customers' lives around the world is kind of a lot more sustaining and emotionally fulfilling on a daily basis.
Can we talk like for a minute, you with a different hat on for a second as an angel investor?
Yep.
So you got a lot of startups in the room, everyone's got their own products and the rest of it. What are you looking for, and what gets you excited if they're coming to see you?
Yeah, I love investing and I love mentoring startups. I think, so I don't know how many of you guys know this, but I'm actually living in Melbourne permanently. I moved to Melbourne in December. I'm spending about 4 months a year in San Francisco and 8 months a year here. And so I'm super personally committed to trying to grow and help the Melbourne startup and Australian startup ecosystem flourish and become more robust. And so I'm definitely interested in investing in Australian startups. I think my feedback about what I'm interested in investing in is different than most Australian investors. I would say that I've noticed that most Australian investors really are quite fixated on revenue growth and revenue establishment quite early. My general personal belief on that and through observation is that companies that focus too early on revenue often do so at the trade-off of having an optimal product experience for their users. And so the kinds of things that I'm really interested in investing in are great product, great founders who really think deeply about user experiences and their products' relationships with their users, and how to create sustainable, long-lasting businesses.
Can we stay on that for a bit?
Sure.
Can we stay on that topic for a bit?
Sure. All right. Is there some exciting investments that you're involved with now that you're excited about?
I haven't closed any yet, but there's definitely a couple of startups that I'm talking to at the moment. Again, I think they share the hallmark of kind of solving a massive worldwide need, and also having relatively interesting, talented, product-minded teams, and also can be global from day one.
What's impressed you about the Australian, let's say specifically the Melbourne ecosystem? What's impressed you about it?
So the Melbourne ecosystem, so I love working in Melbourne. I have to say it's like by far the most friendly work experience I've ever had in my life. It's just such a tight-knit, collaborative, friendly community. I think my husband was saying to me the other day, wow, I don't think I've ever seen you have so much fun working ever before in your life. So that's a testament to the community here, for sure. I think what I've noticed about startup founders here is that they're unusually committed and unusually passionate. Like, you don't get to fail here into a job at Google, right? You don't get to fail here into an acqui-hire at Facebook. When you fail, you fail. And so the people who are working on their startups here are really, really freaking committed, and that's very admirable. It's something that I used to see in Silicon Valley in like 1996, 97, before there was huge amounts of venture capital being thrown into the valley. And that gives me great hope for the startup ecosystem, there's great talent here, and there's passion, and there's genuine commitment. And so what we need to add to the community, I think, here is higher velocity of learning and iteration around sharing experiences from people who have scaled businesses and who, possibly have some pattern matching skills to lend to being able to spot interesting opportunities and interesting constraints early. I think that the Australian startup ecosystem would probably benefit by focusing on like 2 or 3 market sectors and really concentrating its efforts so that the iteration and velocity of learning in those market segments is greatly increased so that we can become globally competitive in those areas.
I've heard Americans say before that generally Australian businesses are kind of closed about what they're working on. Like, what are you working on? Oh, I'm not going to tell you. Whereas Americans, I find, are like, this is what I'm working on. Here's my problem. How can you improve it?
Yeah.
Do you find any of that?
I find that people are generally pretty open in talking to me.
Forget it.
But I would say, like, ideas are worthless, right? I mean, it's really about execution. It's really about your unique ability. Like, I mean, take painting, for example. Like, building a startup product is similar to painting in that fact that there's some science and some art to it. If one artist is going to tell you he's going to paint a picture of a sunflower, and another artist named Van Gogh is going to tell you that he's painting a picture of a sunflower, like, you can see the difference in execution matters quite a bit. I think the same is probably true of actual products.
No, like that. I'm going to open it up for a few questions. Go on, don't be shy. Okay. Yep.
Hi, I'm Sanjay from Mainland Metrics. I've been fortunate to have a business for the last 12 years. In the last 2 years, we sort of moved to the startup model and online model. My question is how do you actually look at getting investors on board and seeding some sort of control when you're the founder? How do you get the right investor on board?
How do you get the right investor on board?
It's totally related to your last question, which is you need to talk about your idea with as many people as possible, because people will attach to your idea if they're excited. That's how you learn to figure out which investors are actually interested. And I think investor relationships are just like founder relationships. I think one of the things that someone asked me before was like, what's the most common startup advice you would give to founders? I think the most common advice is, like, if you take the length of an average marriage, I don't know what it is in Australia, hopefully it's better than the US, but like in the US it's something like 5 to 7 years, right? That's shorter than the amount of time you're going to be working with your co-founders. That's shorter than the amount of time you're going to be working with your investors. And so I feel like a lot of the answer to finding the right co-founder or finding the right investor is basically just having many conversations with them over time, seeing how the conversation flows, seeing what they're passionate and what they're interested in, and seeing where you guys overlap.
I think it's just like we seem to be quite fixated as a community on getting money.
Yeah.
I don't think from anyone that will give me money, I will take it.
Yeah.
Right? Where it should be going out and finding someone that's a good fit for you.
I think that's right. I mean, so personally, I try not to invest in too many things. I try to invest in only the things that I am personally excited about, that I want to spend time on. And ideally, you would find investors who are similar. Yeah.
That's right. Take another question. Yep.
Are there particular startups that you would suggest are really perfect for this ecosystem and really benefit from, particularly the Melbourne ecosystem, versus looking overseas, maybe looking to incubators overseas?
So what kinds of startups would be ideally suited for this ecosystem?
Yeah, and I'm also sort of, the question also relates to, software versus hardware or.
Yeah, so this is not an easy question to answer. I think the question is really like, how do we make the ecosystem here healthier? I think there's a number of things that have to happen in parallel. Like, one, we have to encourage more investors to actually be risk capital investors, because without true risk capital investors, growth is going to be constrained by the expectations of investors, and that's not going to lead to optimal startups, and then that's going to have a self-fulfilling prophecy with investors thinking that they can't get 10x returns on startup investing, which is actually false. The other part of it around Melbourne specifically is I would be looking at the universities and the education system. So what are the university programs that are unusually strong in Melbourne, and how can we build ecosystems around that? So I don't actually know what they are. I've recently begun talking to the Melbourne Uni about helping out with their accelerator program, but say biotech or say medtech is one of those areas. Say big data around agriculture is one of those areas. Like essentially, I think that the startup ecosystem should align with sort of the existing knowledge and expertise that's already being cultivated here.
I don't know if can I just lead on to that question?
Yeah, go on.
I mean, okay, that's really useful feedback about the system here. But say, take for example something like Techstars versus AngelCube here. Would you say that there's something in particular or particular things that the incubators here could be drawing on from those internationally came?
Yeah, so I think my answer is not going to be that brilliant. Like, I think the answer is pretty straightforward, and I think AngelCube is already doing a lot of this, which is, I think, again, as I mentioned, I think one of the things that we needed to hear is increase the velocity around creating economies of scale around learning. And I think you can do that by inviting a lot of people over here. I think that there's also things like, if companies like 99 Designs want to have open work days so that people can come in and observe what it feels like to succeed, to work at a very successful company and to be surrounded by examples of success, that really helps people accelerate their learning opportunities. And so maybe that's something that I can talk about with Lenny Mayo, who I'm collaborating with on some other things, like, how do we give entrepreneurs more access to cycles of learning that are happening already in the Melbourne ecosystem.
Can I talk to you quickly about female entrepreneurship
Sure.
and empowerment? Because
Yeah.
I know that you're a big advocate. And I was talking to you about the event and getting more people. He said, check out the Geek Girls dinner and
Which is going on downstairs.
yeah, it's a bad time, but they're coming next time.
Yeah.
So thank you for that. But what do you see how we can improve? Women getting involved in startups, and you can see from here there's a lot more guys. I mean, how do we help that situation?
So I think the people that I've met in Australia seem relatively supportive. I think everyone here is generally supportive of getting more women involved in the ecosystem and supporting female entrepreneurs. So that's not a barrier. I think that's not a simple question. I think Tom from Sidekicker was asking me how we get more, why are there so few female-founded billion-dollar startups? Why are there so few female-founded unicorns? And I told him that the answer to that is, why are there so few female-founded venture-backed startups? And then the answer to that is, why are there so few female engineers and product managers at successful tech companies? And then the answer to that is actually, why are there so few women doing computer science, math, or physics degrees, or engineering degrees? And so the answer is not super simple. I mean, there's things that we can do at this stage of the ecosystem, which is where women have already self-selected into tech, and where women have already self-selected into entrepreneurship. And I think that there's events that are happening right now, that are in the process of being planned, like She Hacks, which is all about encouraging, female-centered hackathons. There's things that I'm willing to contribute to. I think the answer to your question is really just, it takes grassroots effort and commitment from a few people to start turning that into a movement. And a few people working together turns into a group of people working together, turns into, a body and a community that's willing to affect change at all levels.
Well, I think it also starts with having great female speakers, so thank you
Thanks.
for that. Good.
Yeah, just rewind it back. Is there an alignment between the ecosystem in Silicon Valley and other top topics, and is there an alignment here in ecosystems?
I can't hear you.
Oh, sorry. Is there an alignment between what's happening in Silicon Valley and the US, or not just so in New York as well, in America? Is there a trend? Those trends. Is there an alignment between what's happening here in Australia?
Yeah, definitely. So some of the trends that I see here in Australia that are very promising are, just take 99 Designs, for example. I think, so if we were to talk about areas of specialization where Australia can really dominate in the next generation of startups, Australia is really good at building marketplaces. And that's a global trend. Global marketplaces are only going to increase because The startup cost of building a marketplace is decreasing. The barriers to conducting commerce cross borders is decreasing as well. And so I think that's definitely a trend that's aligned with overall tech investment in Silicon Valley and New York. Other areas would be like hardware hacking. I'd love to see more hardware. Well, so I actually, now I'm contradicting my last point. I would say that there's some areas where there's overlap between Australia and the US investing market, but I would say that we want to probably be pretty specific about where we want to invest our resources, because Australia doesn't have the breadth of resources that the US has for venture investment. So kind of investing in 20 different industries, starting at ground zero, is a really hard way to build an ecosystem.
One thing you mentioned a lot was community. Did Square do anything interesting with building a community of all the different merchants and connecting them so they can collaborate on ways to use?
I wasn't super close with Square at that stage of development. Like, I was much more active in its first stage of, or first year of inception, when it was just getting started. So other than what I mentioned in terms of hand-holding merchants in the very earliest stages, which is also a strategy that Stripe has adopted, for example, other than paying very, very careful attention to things that don't scale, especially around customer service and community building, it's hard for me to comment on Square. But like at Stripe, we take the philosophy of do things that don't scale for as long as possible very, very seriously, because the things that don't scale are what give you competitive differentiation, right? Like unusually great customer service, helping your merchants or customers feel like they're part of your community, that they're beloved by you, is actually something that's very valuable and pays all kinds of dividends, because then they become evangelists and strengthen your brand. And but that's something that doesn't scale.
Yeah. And at free agents, did you do anything?
No, that's maybe one of the reasons why we didn't succeed.
Nick.
Hi.
You spoke about your principles in terms of being an angel investor and how that's closely aligned to mentoring startups. And you also mentioned, a lot of investors in Australia who are quite commercial to focus on revenue generation quite quickly. What advice would you have for people who are actually looking to be angel investors or are actually thinking about it, that don't actually, that aren't too commercial in terms of your pure VCs that are quite cash focused?
So are you saying that you would like advice as an angel investor and you want to be very cash focused?
No, what I'm saying is for people who are looking at angel investing, what advice would you provide to them about supporting the community?
He wants to be on your next investment.
Oh,
So
yeah.
do I, to be honest. A few of us probably want to jump on that.
No, actually, that's the right question to ask. I think the right answer is actually being part of a great syndicate. So if you're just getting started in angel investing, the most value you could add is by being part of a syndicate and being a follow-on investor. And so building relationships with angel investors whom you think have great portfolios, or you think you admire their investing philosophy, is a great strategy.
And what do you think of the angel list of the world?
I'm very supportive of angel lists.
Because I was at a talk with Dinesh, it was with Tim Ferriss, talking about now with those syndicates online, he can basically push the button on $5.5 million for a startup.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
It's awesome, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
I got a question now. You were talking about these data silos. You just have a concern when companies are keeping their data inside like Salesforce, Oracle does.
Yeah.
They're actually owning the whole ecosystem of data. Do you think the kind of progress will be more open or more closed with all these API accesses and all that?
What was your question? Do you think what?
Do you think it's going to be more in the future, more open or more closed? Because when I see like big guys are actually buying small players, like Stripe's going to be bought, whatever, by MasterCard in the future, maybe, whatever. And well, that's actually happening in the Oracle world, and Microsoft's doing that. All these big guys are doing it. They're closing the sales loop just to keep the data and not actually letting anybody else interfere.
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that. I suspect that the Internet of Things is going to be really interesting. Like, the Internet of Things cannot be a data monopoly, right? by definition, has to be an open platform for data sharing because there's no hardware vendor who could essentially control the entire market. So that gives me hope.
Nest has been bought by Google and WhatsApp a week ago before they were bought by Facebook.
Yeah, but Nest and Google is really just like the very first ball and the very first inning of the entire game of Internet of Things. And so the amount of data that Nest and Google is controlling in the Internet of Things is still quite small. Like, I think this is a market that is going to play out over the next 20 years. And I think that before all is said and done, every single large physical device and manufacturer, from consumer electronics to vehicles to home appliances to construction, is going to be totally influenced by Internet of Things, and there's no one dominant player that's, I think, large enough to set the standards and control all the data. So I think that that's going to probably have a big influence on our software industry as well.
We'll take one more question. Yep.
Hi, Sue. Just one question. So you mentioned America and Australia in terms of competitors and where they should focus. Is there any potential for collaboration between Australian startups and the US ecosystem earlier on that, obviously when you grow large, you can move over there?
What kind of collaboration would you have in mind?
It could be engineering talent, it could be product design. So, there's obviously trust issues involved with working with, while pure exchanges like 99 Designs are fantastic, when you're working with high-growth startups, there's obviously, additional relationships that you want to bring in.
So I think the answer is yes. I mean, the question is, can there be more collaboration between Australia's and the US's startup ecosystems? Obviously the answer is yes, but all great movements start with grassroots efforts. And so, for example, last week we were just at RubyConf Australia, and they've really put a lot of effort into making sure that there's great diversity amongst their speakers, and also facilitating a lot of collaborative discussions by having community-wide dinners and events around that. And so I think what 99 Designs is doing here around opening their space up to speakers like myself and other folks is also indicative. And AngelCube and other accelerators are constantly bringing their teams back to the US. Possibly what would be cool is if AngelCube's teams who went to the US could come and give a talk around what they observed and what they learned and share that knowledge back with the community. But all this stuff is happening, and I think what I'm observing is that the momentum around all these activities is accelerating. And eventually all of this grassroots effort does sort of coalesce into something more structured. But probably we're like a year or two away from more structure, since there's just so much more grassroots stuff that needs to be done.
All right, I want everyone back on their feet. And a big round of applause for Susan Wu.